Chris, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I've been listening to your podcast for a while, so this is a real treat to have you on here and share some of your journey. It's always fascinating, and I don't know about you from a research standpoint when you have guests on, but obviously I know enough about you to be dangerous from listening to the podcast, and then when you start doing this deeper research of like your life and all these interesting things that seem like has happened, and it's kind of it tells this story, and that's one of the things I wanted to kind of chat about. Not only just about getting started, but kind of some of these different inflection points that we each have that really change us off a course we thought we were going to go down, and all of a sudden transition into this randomness that brings you at where you're at in life today. Um, so let's start in this section, which I think will be important for folks because, and tell me if maybe I'm way off here, but back in '08, it seemed like there was a massive change with getting laid off that really changed the course of your life. I'm sure there were multiple spots like this, but would you say that might have been one of the biggest points? If you didn't go through that, you may not even be close to where you're at today. Is that a fair assessment?
I think there was a point right before that was probably even more impactful, and I'll give some context. So I was working at a management consulting firm. I knew that I wasn't going to do that job forever, and I had gone to this event in Boston called Startup Weekend,
Mhm.
and in a weekend we built a company, and that company wasn't a company that went on to do anything, right? But it demonstrated that 3 or 4 people could build a product, put it on the internet, people could use it, and all in a couple days. And it totally changed my perspective of what I wanted to do in my life. And so I thought, where do people do this for a living? They do it in the Bay Area. I have to move there. I moved there with the intent of one day kind of moving into that industry, but I really had no clue how or what or anything. And then I got laid off about a month after moving here, and it really accelerated that. But prior to getting laid off, I'd kind of mentally made the commitment to move to California, to move to the Bay Area because I wanted to pivot into a new career, doing a new thing. So I'll say, like, it definitely accelerated that. Would I have done it 2 years, 3 years, 6 months later? I don't know how long it would have taken, but I appreciate that I was forced to do it sooner.
What was the was I and I know and partly too because I think that spawned you to go to South by Southwest, which seemed like that was another big turning point, right? Just after that. So
Yeah, so when I got laid off, I was like, well, I don't know what to do. I live in the Bay Area. I kind of like technology. I need to go meet people. I need to figure out what kind of job I can have. And I started this conference called Laid Off Camp, and it was loosely based around this thing called Bar Camp, which was kind of an unconference for technology people. And so South by was at the time an early conference in technology. It was long been big in music, but back in 2008, the technology side of it was pretty early. I was like, well, if this is the place where everyone is going, if I want to get kind of infused into this industry, this is where I need to go. And the only network of technology people I had were people I'd met at 2 startup weekend events, or actually 3, because I went to the one in Boston and I was like, wow, this has changed my outlook. Then they had one in New York, and I was like, well, I have to go to that one. And then they had one in San Francisco. So before I lived here, I flew out and went to that one. And so I'd gone to these 3 events, and that network of people I'd met were all going to South by. And so I was like, wherever the people I want to work with, kind of in a macro sense, are, if they're
mm,
all gathering somewhere, I want to go there. And I think that's been a recurring theme. It's like, put yourself in the place where all the people doing the thing you want to do are, because you'll probably build a network that'll make it easier to do that thing.
mm. Where do you think you learned that from?
I honestly don't know. I've tried to interview my parents and understand my childhood, but I was kind of always someone that would just seek out random things. Like, I really loved cell phones in high school and the internet. And I was like, gosh, I want a new phone. So my friend and I would drive to New York on the bus, or once he got a license, and we would like go to Chinatown to these importing phone shops and like learn about all of the different phones that were getting imported from Europe, because American phones were just kind of lagging significantly. And we would buy one and play around with it and build these mobile websites that worked on phones way before phones had web browsers or anything. It was on a system called WAP.
Mm.
I don't know why. That was instinctually what I thought I should do.
Well, this comes back to the, and I, this actually is a recurring theme that's come up over the last several interviews I have around, is there an innate ability? Like, is something are we born with, or is there something like a discipline people can build to flex that muscle, if you will, if they don't have it? What are your thoughts on that? Like, is that something that's just hard for people to grasp, or anyone in the right mind can do it if they just put some time into it?
I think someone told me the other day, and I really wish I could give them proper attribution here, but they said something to the tune of sometimes it's really hard to change the way you are, and you just have to start doing the thing, and you will change with that. So it's like if you want to be the kind of person that goes to more entrepreneurial events, you can start to think about why you're not and start to figure it out. Or you could just start going to them and let your being adapt to your activities. So I do think to some extent, if there are things that you want to be more like, just start doing them, right? Like it sounds so simple, but it also is counterintuitive to a lot of people. I don't know. I'm sure some of the traits I have are instinctual and not learned, but I don't think there's anyone that can't learn how to get more comfortable talking to people, learn how to put themselves out there, learn how to use the internet to find an event that might be worth going to, that kind of stuff.
Well, and yeah, I agree with you because I think I'm kind of in the camp of like, didn't think I could do anything in life. I was always kind of, okay, let someone else lead, or that's for someone else. Brian wasn't good enough. And I have this actually on my mirror. It's a question I ask myself often. It says, why can't it be you? And it's this idea of always like, if I see something out there that's kind of cool, why can't I be the one that build it? So to your point, I think you have to almost be willing to jump out, into traffic, if you will, if you're not ready, right? Because we're not going to probably be ready. And if we're waiting to be ready, we're going to miss the boat, heavily. That's at least
Yeah,
what I think, right?
I'm probably pretty crazy. I can look back to a lot of examples of constantly just challenging the status quo. And I was in school in college and I was like, I know how to do what this course is supposed to teach me. Can I just not take it? And then they were like, well, actually, I found out through a series of conversations that the school had a process that you could say, I want an exam that if I can pass the exam, I get a pass on the class. And like you could do that with any class. And so then I just started finding courses that I thought I could pass from the get go to get more credits
Mm.
and just start doing it. And so I would just constantly be asking people, why not? Why not? I was wildly curious and willing to kind of challenge authority. And that combination has played really well 90% of the time and probably less well 10% of the time. But I think the trade off is worth it.
Mm. Well, one of the things I loved, and I mean, you could share a story if you want, was like you approached your parents to go to boarding school. Is that right? Did I get the facts right on that?
Yeah. So I never knew what boarding school was. And I remember I was browsing the internet back pre search on Yahoo, and they just have these directories where, right, there was no searching really. And so I was browsing, and then I found this school in Boston. I think it was called Concord Academy. I can't remember exactly. And I was like, what is this? And I like looked at their website, and it was like, oh, it's a school that you live at. And I was like, what? Like, I had no idea that this was a thing. And I just started reading and I was like, I wonder if there are other schools like this. And of course, my parents knew that this was a thing, but I didn't. And I was like, wow, my parents both work. And I didn't have as much freedom as someone in, middle school, elementary school without a car, living in the suburbs where I can't walk around. I was like, wow, if I went to boarding school, I would have all the freedom I want because the boarding schools that I looked at were connected to public transportation, which where I lived wasn't. And, all your friends lived on campus. So it seemed like the ultimate access to freedom that in hindsight, I probably would have gotten a lot more of if I had just waited, gotten a driver's license in high school and been able to drive. But I didn't have friends with driver's licenses at the time and it seemed awesome. And I think my parents watched my challenging of authority personality and thought, this might actually be good for you also. I wasn't thinking about it from that perspective at all. I just thought about it from kind of freedom and proposed it and it worked out. Now, in hindsight, as a parent, knowing how much private education costs, I, I don't think I factored that in as much as I probably in hindsight wish I had, right? It was like, oh, can you send me to this school? I didn't have a concept of what, a few tens of thousands of dollars would have cost. Like, I was just like, can you do it? And, but it was a lot.
How much do because and I think you talk about your parents, they were both business owners themselves?
They owned a company together. So
Okay.
they owned a long distance company together. And then, my dad's worked for people and then worked for himself. They've owned a conference planning company where they planned industry conferences for the telecom industry. And so they've kind of had a lot of their hands in small business. But funny enough, I don't know if I would say that was more something that I picked up not directly. Like they never sat down and they're like, we run a business. Here's how it works.
Yeah.
It was more like through osmosis of just being around it, maybe.
Well, because that's always the curiosity of like, especially what you're doing today, what you have been doing, right? It's not the common path. So, like, was there a point? Because obviously, you went the common path to start after school, right? You in the management consulting stuff for a couple of years, but I wonder if there was almost like a lack of patience because you knew the other way that could be done. Versus a lot of people don't realize they can start their own business. I don't know if you've ever thought about that of how that could have helped you or not. I don't know.
I think I always assume there's another way forever, right? Someone to an unhealthy level, probably where someone will present something and just for sport, I'll want to prove them wrong and find something that supports the alternative. And then as soon as I've proven them that, this other thing is a better path, once they've accepted it, I immediately want to go back and try to defend their original stance. Like I just have this desire to assume that what anyone says could be wrong and there might be a better way to do something. And so I never accept, you know, conventional wisdom, status quo. I feel like there's always going to be a better way to do something and I'd love to know it. And that's literally the premise of what I do for a living now, but it probably took me 20 years to realize that that trait of my personality could be my career.
Wha what's the healthy lesson in there? If what you're doing is unhealthy, is there a healthy lesson for folks?
Um, I don't know if successful entrepreneurship I don't know if there's like a healthy version of it.
Mm,
I did this great interview with one of my mentors, a guy named Andy Ratcliffe, and the takeaway quote was like, I don't think work-life balance works if you want to be successful, like really successful. You could have a business that makes money and provides for your family, but like if you want to be really ambitious and really successful, like you just have to give up a lot of things, and some of those things are, at times your sleep or your sanity or many other things.
mm. Do you have a definition of success?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I know a lot of folks talk about because the word success gets used a lot, and depending on the person, like, is that money? Is success spending more time with your family? Is success, whatever, taking away a lot of the friction? I don't know. I've heard it from different folks. So yeah, I'm kind of curious how you think about like, do you have goals that you're setting of I have to achieve these benchmarks, or is it more just being a part of the journey is what's successful? You're doing the things you want to do.
Yeah, I am not someone who says like my goal is to have this much revenue this year or grow my net worth by this. It's kind of like understand the general direction things should go and just check into whether it's going along in that direction, and if it's not, course correct. But I'm not as much a super macro level goal setter, but on the micro level, I'm like, well, we need to do X. I want to ship an episode every week. I want to ship a newsletter every 2 weeks. So I guess I have those level goals, but high level, I don't think I have them. And if I do have them, I'm always willing to say, well, that was the goal, but I have this other idea. Let's do that instead.
Is there certain from the micro level, and we talked, I know a little before recording about the podcast and stuff. Is there ways that you try to set up your schedule? Do you batch record certain episodes? Do you write at a certain time? Like, is there certain things you try to do with your schedule that help you achieve those micro goals?
I think it's not what I think you or anyone listening would want to hear, but maybe it is. Um, I try to and it sounds so cliche to say it this way, but it's like strike while the iron's hot. So, for example, we're in the process of redesigning the logo for the podcast, the branding, all this stuff. And I've really struggled to nail down the final design for the podcast cover. And yesterday, I probably had 5 things that were important to get done. And then the redesign is like not one of those 5 things, but I was really inspired to do it. And I
Mhm.
knew that I could probably get work that might take me 20 hours in another window done in 2 or 3 hours. Cause I could just tell that like my flow state right now is going to be working on this redesign project. So
Mhm.
let's capitalize on that because I find that I'm sometimes 5, 10 times more productive if I'm working on the thing that I'm most productive at in the moment. And so, if you forced me to do what I think a lot of productivity people do, and they say, I'm going to block off 9 a.m. on Tuesday
Right.
to, prepare for X. Well, 9 a.m. on Tuesday, I might be in a really creative mode thinking about something else. If you ask me to do this other task, it might take 3 times longer than if I do it at another time. And so my calendar is mostly wide open. And I have a list of priorities that I know need to get done, but I don't try to structure out when they're going to happen.
But I think there is a lesson in there, right? Of you have that's how you like if you try to do it the way the productivity experts tell you to do it, you would probably pull your hair out, right? Because you're like, I can't do this. This is putting me in a box. So I think part of it is you're with your personality, that's the way you work best, right?
A part of me thinks that if I forced myself to do it the way that other people successfully do it, it would work over time.
Okay.
But I don't have a lot of self discipline. So I don't know. I don't know. It would take a lot to get there.
Well, I mean, I guess if you recognize there's an awareness there, that's important.
Yes.
Um, what tell me about the state of the podcast right now. Like, did you think it would ever get to this level of success when you started it?
Not even a little. I mean, when I started, I was working at Wealthfront where I'd sold my last company. And I remember asking them, like, starting a podcast, as you know, like, there's not that many costs, right? It's
Right.
you buy a microphone, you have a computer, and, that's kind of it, right? Like, that's all you really need to get started. And I thought, wow, I don't know if this could be big or not. And I remember asking Wealthfront if we could kind of make it part of my job. I was like, could this be a Wealthfront podcast? Could you guys own this podcast and I could just work on it? And that goes to the reason I started it, right? The reason I started it is because I enjoyed talking about these topics and I wanted to do that and share it with other people. And so it wasn't at all about starting a business, making money, or anything like that. So when I first started, I pitched Wealthfront on could I just create this internally? It'll be a Wealthfront podcast
Mm.
and I'll just run it and talk about what I want. And they said no. And I was like, fine, I'll start it on my own on the side. We kind of wrote up a little thing to be very clear that I own it and they don't. And I ran forward with it. So obviously, had I known it would become what it did, I never would have proposed that to Wealthfront.
Right.
So I had no clue at the time. I didn't even know if it would last more than 8 episodes.
Mm. Did you have a plan going in, like you wanted to do a certain amount then, or you just one episode at a time? You kind of just threw it
I
together.
told myself I'm going to do 8 episodes. Like
Oh,
8 could be season 1, and so I'll try to record 8. I'll put them all out, and if people like it, I'll keep going, and if people don't like it, then I'll stop. And we had such a successful launch of the podcast that by episode 2, there were enough people listening that I was like, I'm going to keep doing this.
oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's always tough because especially that, or I mean, especially me, I had zero audience, zero no one. It was like my mom was probably the only one listening for the first handful of episodes. It's kind of like, yeah, you have to almost just keep chopping wood, right, for a period of time and just say, hey, I enjoy doing it. That's the only
Yes,
way
I
I
think
think
it depends, you know, where you are in your career, what you've done before, how easy or not easy it would be to build an audience. And I think there are a lot of platforms that are far faster and easier to build audiences on than
Mhm.
podcasting. Podcasting might be the worst.
Yeah.
Um, podcasting is one of the best for taking a listener and building a really deep relationship, and probably the worst for finding new listeners. So I think it was a good channel because I built up a decent audience of I would say a small audience of people with their own large audiences. So I had a lot of support when I launched the podcast from friends who had far more followers than I did, and I had a niche where I was considered an expert on in the kind of miles points world
Mhm.
that gave me a ability to go be a guest on other podcasts and be featured in some media, and that all helped kind of launch and grow the show early on. If I didn't have any of those things, you know, I probably would have made it past 8 episodes.
Mm. Well, I think one of the other things you did, and maybe again, maybe you do this just kind of like I did. Like the reason this is started because I didn't start a podcast for 2 years. So it's called Just Get Started, whatever. I started in 2017 because I know there was a lot of people that struggle like I did. And it goes back to, I remember you saying the theme of your life, if something can't be done, let's try it anyways. And it kind of relates to your podcast. It's like, everyone is looking at this as the one path to go, but you're trying to find all these different ways to do things. I mean, that's kind of what the podcast is about, right?
Yeah, I
So
mean, the
in a way, you're kind of
general
living that
theme
ethos.
is I want the best of everything, and I don't want to pay a premium for it. So, whether that's, in a lot of cases, it might be the best healthcare, right? Like, I would love to have the best healthcare, but I'm not going to go pay $50 to $100,000 a year for a concierge doctor.
Mhm.
So, how can I use the skills I have of some combo of networking and research and curiosity to arrive at a very similar outcome across every aspect of your life, whether it's your business, your health, your money, your travel? And a lot of this started when I had this consulting job because I realized I'd had one job before that in investment banking. And I was like, I don't like either of these jobs. I can't do these forever.
Yep.
But these are supposed to be the best jobs. So if I have the best jobs and I don't enjoy them, I need to save as much money as possible so that I can stop working and live off my savings. But I don't want to give up and sacrifice life for that. So I wasn't going to go live with 7 roommates eating beans and rice and doing nothing. So I was like, okay, well, I like traveling. How do you travel for free? I don't want 7 roommates. How do you house hack? Like, how do you go through a series of every element of your life to make sure that you're getting the best value? So, whether that's getting a new iPhone every time it comes out for free instead of paying $1,000 for it, that's an easy one, right? There's easy ways to do that. There's easy ways to make sure you're earning the most interest on all of your cash. There's easy ways to travel for free, to get the best deal on insurance, to
Yep.
eliminate a lot of health problems just by learning how to breathe properly. So that became the theme: is just upgrade and optimize your life, your money, and your travel.
What's been you personally? I guess you could take if someone shared a story with you, but what's been personally your best like hack that you've done, maybe in the last handful of years that you're proud of? Like, I found this, I tried it, it worked. Which one
Man,
stands out?
this is a question where, we talked about how much you edit the show. If I knew you edited it, I would take some time and really think about it, but we're not. So I'm on the spot. You
We
know,
can if we want.
no, it's a really tough question because I don't know how to value certain things against each other well, right? Like, I'm sure
Mm.
I've had some hacks that have helped with my relationship with my kids. Well, like, that seems way more meaningful than saving, 50% on health insurance, right? But the quote, I take quotes from reviews and feature them on the website, and someone listening saved, I want to say $15,000 annually on all of their insurance policies. So, like, the impact that will have on their lives is pretty incredible. I, on the other hand, it's interesting. I probably spent 30 hours researching insurance, managed to save myself, maybe $900 a year, which on a relative percentage basis was a massive discount. It's better than the, Geico saved 20% or whatever. But it, dollar per hour wasn't really the most optimal thing. So I could go through all of these hacks that we've learned and mindset shifts, but comparing them seems so challenging. I don't even know where I would start.
Mm. Well, in terms of let's go to kind of the one that is it's top of mind for you, like a hack that for some reason other people aren't really thinking about. It's not getting enough buzz, but you think it's vitally important for people to consider. Is there one kind of top of mind for you?
Let's see. I think a big one is I meet people that start a business or and but it's not, they don't know it's a business, right? And so they don't treat it as a business. So I meet so many podcasters that operate their podcast only from the creative perspective,
Mhm.
or they have a side hustle and they treat it like a passion project, and that's fine if you consciously chose to do that. But oftentimes I meet people that just that something switches in their head where they realize that this thing they're doing actually could be optimized like a business, just like they do, at work for whatever they do for a living. And if you apply that concept to anything in your life, I think all of us are optimizers. And I think we're just optimizers in one area, right? We all probably have a friend who's like a nerd and an expert on their fitness routine, right? And if you can learn how to channel the curiosity you have in one area of your life, whether that's your fitness or cooking or, you know, making PowerPoint presentations or building spreadsheets or whatever it is, if you could start to realize that that curiosity can be harnessed and channeled anywhere else, you unlock everything, right? You could take that and find that whether it's saving money on your insurance or traveling for free or getting your kid into daycare, like there's a way to apply time, energy, research, and curiosity to get a better outcome in all of those areas.
Hmm. Yeah, that is a great point because there is a lot of I mean, I probably do this too if I was thinking about it, but yeah, a lot of folks that'll hardcore in a certain area. Maybe it is work, and then for some reason they can't figure it out with their parenting, or they can't fit. They're unhealthy, or they're whatever. So that is a great point. Is like, how do you like? Why is work so successful? Why can't you relate that to other areas of your life if that's what you're trying to get at? If you're trying to turn the dial in the right direction, yeah, that's
Yeah.
a great
I mean,
point.
there are other hacks like, you could go look for unclaimed money, and I've had people find a few $1,000s in 10 minutes that they didn't know about. And like that's a great hack, but it's kind of a completely different one, right? Like if you go to look at your state's unclaimed money registrar, chances are someone that's listening to this, if they look themselves up, maybe their parents, their siblings, they're going to find someone who's owed $100 or more. And we've had people find thousands of dollars. So finding free money is awesome. That's a great hack, but it's not
Yeah.
going to, necessarily be repeatable for the rest of your life and 10x anything over life. But look, if you're listening and you go look for, the state's unclaimed money database, put in your name and your address, and you find that you had $1,000 you didn't know about, I bet you're going to have a really good night tonight and feel awesome.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about like conventional wisdom. Instead of just taking things at face value, it's figuring out like there's other ways around it. There's not one path forward. So even it's funny because I was talking with my girlfriend about this like prior because she's using one of the big banks, and I was telling her about one of your articles. I said, if you look at there's some other banks you may consider that are better optimized for X, Y, and Z. And it got a good discussion of like just because you've been doing it this way for like 10 years doesn't mean you have to keep forward with that. But I think that's how a lot of us think, right? Is we've done it this way, why change?
Yeah, the inertia is hard. And I think especially when you're young and, even 5 years ago, it's like, oh, if there are no interest rates, then, sure, banking at Chase or Bank of America, there's not really a big impact of doing that versus something else. But right now, there's a handful of banks, and I just did an episode on this, so you can go scroll back and look for it. Like you can earn 5% on all of your money. Now, depending on how much money you have, that might not even matter, right? If you keep $100 in your checking account and you live at home and you don't have a job, okay, who cares? This is not where you want to harness and your
Right.
attention and spend your time and energy. But if you have lots of expenses and you keep $100,000 in your bank account at any given point in time, whether it's earning 0 or 5% probably is pretty meaningful. And so and it's not that much extra effort. And I think figuring that out and then learning to find your personal threshold, I think is for when your time is worth it or not is important. So I'll give an example here. I always like a deal and I always like to get things for a better price. And so once I had a podcast, I was like, you know what? There are a lot of people listening. They probably don't need to know where I live. And it turns out if you go search for your name and your address and just search it on Google, you're probably going to find that there are multiple websites that list your name and your home address online. And they probably list your phone number. Many of them list your siblings, maybe your email address, your age, your spouse. And it's even scarier when you start to do this for your parents and you think, gosh, my parents are maybe more susceptible than I am to getting a phone call of someone trying to steal their identity, pretend I'm in the hospital, something like that. And I thought, okay, that's not good. Let's get rid of all this. And so I was searching around for how to do this. And there are companies you can pay and they will remove all this information. Or you can go to each individual data broker site and there's usually an opt out process. And I started going through this process thinking I was getting a good deal by saving my time and my energy doing this. But it turns out I was like, wow, I could spend 40 hours on this, or I could spend like $100 and have it all solved. And by the way, these data brokers, they're buying and selling databases constantly. So just because you remove it now doesn't mean it's gone in 6 months. And so you've got to come back and continue to stay on top of it. So I think one really important lesson that I've learned is the DIY approach often values your time at some insignificant amount of money. And you need to value your time, especially if you have a family or a business, because what you could be doing with that time could almost always generate more satisfaction or income than what you're saving trying to research the internet. This happened to my wife. She was trying to research the internet to find good recipes to introduce our 6-month old to a bunch of foods
Mhm.
to save, I don't know, it was like $50 or $20 on a 100-day meal plan of, meal ideas for a 6-month old to introduce them to food. And I was like, if you're going to spend 6 hours doing this when you could spend 20 to $50, it's just not a good deal. Like you
Yeah.
should spend the money. And so the company that does that, Delete Me, not only did I start using Delete Me to find all my data and get it all removed, now I've bought it for my parents. My wife has an account. My in-laws have an account. And then we reached out to them. We were like, can you guys be sponsors of the show? And so learning to value my time as a great way to kind of close the loop on this story. I thought I was saving money by doing it myself. I gave up on that notion and I spent the money, had such a great experience that one, I saved myself time in the future of having to find gifts because I already had a great idea.
Yeah.
And then more importantly, I reached out to them and they became a sponsor. And the amount, that has generated for the business is greater than the cost of the product in the first place. So, um, yeah, I mean, Delete Me's been a great partner of ours. You should check it out. Anyone that has a business and doesn't want the world to know their home address, or doesn't have a business and doesn't want the world to know their home address, should check it out.
No, that's a tremendous point because actually it's funny when you're saying that. I'm like, I remember, I don't know how many years ago now. It's probably been 6 years ago or so. I did that same thing. It's like, oh, let me go online. Let me find. I think I randomly found it, and then I'm like, yeah, you have to go into each website and do all that crap. I like this delete me idea because I haven't looked at stuff recently, so that's actually a good point. But it does go back to even when we think about starting, it's like everyone wants to do everything, but when you try to do everything, your time gets sucked and you actually are not focusing on the one thing that you probably should be doing, and you lose just so much traction in the process. And I think that's why a lot of folks get stuck early on is they're like in this sludge, but if they just focused on one thing versus the 20 they're trying to do, they would be so much further ahead. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, this is why I love second time founders, because the first go around, you're like, "Ooh, we got a new office. Let's all take a trip with me and my co-founder to, I don't know, Best Buy and go buy a TV for the office, and let's go to, Walmart and buy a microwave for the kitchen." And then, your company more likely than not, just cuz statistically it does, ends up failing, And then you look back and you're like, gosh, why did we spend a week like going to IKEA and building furniture and all this stuff? Like, why were we wasting our time when we hadn't figured out if the business actually worked? And so every time I talk to second time founders or even first time founders a couple years in, they've kind of realized that early on, you think there's so many cool, fun things that can be distracting from, does this business work? Have I found product market fit?
Well, that might be a good transition then, because so whether someone's starting a business or again, maybe they want to start a podcast or something, I used to ask on the podcast, I used to ask, give me advice, Chris, about how someone would start. But I've changed that because I think advice is, it's based on your experience. What is an idea from a standpoint of challenge or action item someone can take? So maybe it's a question they should be asking themselves. Maybe it's a challenge you would say, hey, start this today or try this today. Anything as you're thinking about that, as I'm mentioning it, would be helpful for them to take action on their idea or whatever endeavor they want to go down.
Yeah, I did an interview with Noah Kagan, who wrote this book, Million Dollar Weekend, and he has a pretty good framework in there. So I'm not going to try to rip it off. I'll just tell you to go listen to the episode I did with him or buy the book. And it's like, you have this idea, and you can get up in your head that it's going to take 6 months to figure it out, but you could probably launch a version of it in a weekend. And that version might just be seeing if you can find 10 people to buy a product or trying to record an episode of a podcast or write a blog post. Like any of these things, you can kind of put one piece of the puzzle together in a very short period of time. And I would say, don't get caught up in, the quality of the first thing. And almost everyone that seems to succeeds through repetition. So go back and look at Mr. Beast, the best, biggest YouTuber around. His first videos were terrible, and he will admit that, right? Like Marquise Brownlee, another well-known YouTuber, his first videos, like he didn't know what he was doing. He was a kid. He was just recording random stuff, but he was super passionate about it. And over time, he honed his craft. Don't feel like you have to hone the craft before you get started. Put the reps in, figure out what you can do in an hour, not even a weekend.
Yeah, I love that. What are you focused on for, and I mean, not that you're doing a weekend. Did I see that are you writing a book right now? Can you talk about that? Maybe not.
I can talk about it. I don't know how to answer it. So I I wasn't sure. I had a bunch of thoughts, and I could never really. Someone was like, "You should write a book," and I was like, "Cool. What would that book be about?" And I was like, well, "I don't know. I have a lot of opinions, but I haven't figured it out." So I worked with this woman, and we got to a place where I actually had a framework to have better outcomes. And it's like kind of a bunch of principles that, when followed, lead to better outcomes. And they're kind of summarizing what I do that leads to my own better outcomes. And so we put together a proposal for a book. And I would say it's like 90% of the way there. And for reasons that I don't have a good answer for, it's been 6 months and it hasn't gone anywhere past 90%. And I don't know why. So yes, I would say I'm not actively working on it because it would be hard for me to defend if it's a priority for me. How have I not made progress in 6 months? Which, by the way, is a great framework to approach almost anything, right? I was talking to a family member that's like, I want to lose weight. And I was like, then what are you doing about it? And they were doing nothing. I was like, well, then you must not really want to. She's like, no, I really want to. I was like, you should just stop lying to yourself. If you're not willing to do anything, you don't really want to do it. And
Yeah.
so clearly my actions would show that I don't really want to write a book. I really wanted to figure out what I would write a book about. And I think I conflated that with wanting to write a book. But now that I've figured it out, I'm not sure if I want to write a book.
Mm. Though, I think that's probably a great way to summarize our conversation because it's about getting started. It's not an easy path, right? You go through these struggles. Someone would look at you and like, wow, he's wildly successful. He's done all this great stuff. But even you struggle with, do I want to do stuff? Is this what I'm passionate about? So it's not, everyone goes through this shit. It's not, just the common person. So I think that's a great lesson actually for people to hear from you is like, you don't know yet. And that's okay.
Yeah, I
It's not
mean,
the end of the
just
world.
to sympathize with people more, I'll spend 6 hours doing none of the things that I need to do today, like, and waste a day going down some rabbit hole. And the silver lining is I think I've now found a business where that actually works. So before this, I would be working at a job and I would, instead of doing my job one morning, I would be like, oh, I'm really fascinated in how to get a better deal on my insurance policy because it's coming up for renewal. And I'd spend all this time and energy. And then I would have to stay up late to make up for the work I didn't do. Now I found a way to take this thing that I just love doing. And then I'm like, oh, well, now let's make an episode about it. So
Mm.
if there's a thing that distracts you from your main work that you could just go down a rabbit hole on and enjoy, gosh, is there a way that you could, in a weekend or an hour, test whether there's something that could turn into a side hustle or a business for you? And don't have the expectations up front that it's going to replace your income, but at least have the expectations that, it'll satisfy your curiosity and maybe one day replace your income.
Mm. I love that. Chris, that's a good spot to end on today. All right, you got the podcast, all the hacks. Where do you spend the most time online? Is it Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it now?
I would say I share 99% of things on the podcast, and I'll post once every month somewhere on the
Okay.
internet. So if you want to stay on top of anything, listen to the podcast and subscribe to the newsletter. So once every 1 to 2 weeks, I'll send out all the most interesting stuff I'm finding on the internet, whether it's deals or new products or services or content I'm creating. And then on the podcast every week we release a new episode that goes down some topic in ways that you can upgrade and optimize your life. You could get both of them at allthehacks.com, or if you're listening to a podcast, just search All the Hacks wherever you are right now.
Chris, thank you so much, man. This is a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.